the role of the private sector and REDD+, I'd like to tell you a bit more about the results of that study. And to remind you the goal and the main question we were looking at. So our goal was, of course, to be able to improve the REDD+ outcomes by fostering successful private sector engagement. And we have looked at 3 key questions. First, who are the key private sector players in REDD+, and what are the motivation and types of intervention, to try to have some trends about this, first of all. Second, what are the challenges and the enabling condition for the private sector engagement in REDD+, and finally, how can we actually enhance the private sector engagement in REDD+. So just briefly to give you an idea of the methodology, we have reviewed different dozen of REDD+ projects, including some reforestation projects where the private sector was involved in different ways. And we also conducted many interviews with representatives from the private sector, representatives from the government to have their perspective as well, and representative from the third sector, such as international NGOs who are leading projects where the private sector is also involved. So, first of all, we wanted to have a systematic way to actually be able to find what are the key players of the private sector involved in REDD+. And if we use the concept of supply chain, where you have different standard functions such as primary production, processing, distribution and trading, and consumption, and so where you have different a flow of person, technologies, organization, information, resources through which a set of inputs are going to be transformed into the final product that will be purchased by the final end buyers or consumers on the demand side. We have tried to look at a simplified REDD+ supply chain that would revolve around the consumption and delivery of carbon sequestration as a key ecosystem services, and to map what would be the main business function in that REDD+ supply chain. So we've came up with 4 primary functions. First of all, investment, project development and implementation, carbon credit trading and retailing, and carbon credit purchasing. And then some other auxiliary functions such as capacity building, technical advisory, as well as validation and certification of emission reduction for the carbon credits, which are also very important for the REDD+ life cycle. So this is the basis on which I will present you what are the main key players for each of those functions. So first, if we look at the investment part, who are the players, what is the form of intervention, and what are the main motivation? First, there are a couple of pioneering investment funds that are actually directly investing in REDD+ project, directly with the project developers, and they are entering this market because they also want to take advantage of getting an early share of the REDD+ carbon credits and being able to actually resell it for profit, for a higher price later on within voluntary or pre-compliance markets. And such examples include, for instance, the Altelia Climate Fund, Macquarie International Finance Corporation, as well as Terra Global Capital, for instance, which are new multi-million funds. We also have some banks. For instance, we can give the example of Netbank and also BNP Paribas, which have stakes in one of the REDD+ project, very important, for instance, the Kasigao Corridor project, which is led by Wildlife Works, a private company in Kenya. That was also the first REDD+ project that got verified and certified carbon emission credits. And another form of intervention is instead of direct investment. That can also be through pre-buying the carbon credits through purchase agreement. That allows as well the project developers not to have to find end buyers at the end of the project. And we also have some emission-intensive industry that are engaging, that are investing in REDD+ projects through pre-buying carbon credits as well. In that regard, for voluntary credits offsetting. Some large multinational firms are also investing through the form of grant. That's the case, for instance, of Walt Disney Corporation, which is supporting a REDD+ project in DRC that is led by Conservation International, for instance. And so in that instance, it is the reason, the main motivation behind is for corporate social responsibility purposes. And finally, we have some medium to large size carbon offset private firms that are actually directly investors, and as we'll see after, developer of REDD+ projects. So those carbon private firms, for instance, we can cite Wildlife Works, Salt Pole Carbon Management, and many more. Their core business is actually innovating with some new climate-friendly solution. So this is actually part of REDD+ has become part of their activities, like a niche of activities, and this is their core business, of course. So they are wearing several hats: developing, implementing REDD+ project, investing, but also we'll see later actually involving many different other points of the REDD+ supply chain. And again, some large multinational firms, some are not only investing in the REDD+ project, they are also actually part of implementing the REDD+ project. For instance, in Philippines, we have Toyota Motor Corporation that has a specific department which is dedicated to support the REDD+ project and other reforestation projects, and through technical support, for instance, for MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, or GIS support, establishment of reference level, etc. So they are also part of the implementation for corporate social responsibility purposes, but also for branding and greening the image. Because, for instance, Toyota Motor Corporation doesn't really have a direct link, with the forest, but they because of the greenhouse emission that are there from the activity, they also want to green the image. Then we have more and more actually companies that are involved in the secondary market, so buying the carbon credits and reselling it for higher prices in the future. So doing some brokering activities, and they are, for instance, climate care. We have carbon fund. So we have different big companies as well involved there. And for the carbon credit purchasing, so the end buyers here, like just the primary market, the main buyers are so far emission-intensive industries or large multinational firms. And this for different type of motivation, mainly for the voluntary carbon offsetting or pre-compliance, and then for corporate social responsibility or branding. So far, of course, the compliance aspect is a very little share of the market, given that REDD+ has not yet a compliance market. Then in terms of the validation and certification, we have different type of audit firms, certification firms that are part of this business as well. And capacity building and technical advisory, there is actually a strong niche of activities for those firms as well, because most of the time there is not enough capacity and technology at subnational or national level. So those companies are also bringing a lot of information in terms of mapping, monitoring, reporting, verification. So a lot of technical support, but also some advisory in terms of the laws and the strategies. So in terms of the key findings, what we can see that the function I have described first, they are not mutually exclusive. A private sector actor can actually wear several hats simultaneously. And of course, as Jessica and Sophie mentioned before, the private sector involvement is critical first for scaling up investment in REDD+. So far, for instance, there is need of like between 17 and 40 billion annually per year to support the REDD+ activities, whereas since 2008, the amount that the countries has pledged is around, cumulatively, is around 7.5 billion. So you can see there is a high gap. So the private sector would be critical to actually help to scale up investment for REDD+, but not only. Private sector is very important as well to foster innovation in REDD+, using the expertise in technology, in efficiency. So they really have a critical role to play. And as you can see from the description of the main actors that are currently involved from the private sector perspective, there are not yet a lot of for instance, extractive industries and export-oriented agribusiness industry that are really directly involved in REDD+. And it's also actually important to involve them because, as you know, the private sector can be the cause of the problem, but also part of the solution. So it's important to also involve those actors that are somehow driving the deforestation, but can actually help to tackle the problem as well. In terms of the trends for the top 3 motivation for the private sector, so far, because there is not yet a compliance market, the main motivation is the resale of carbon credits in for the voluntary market so far, or in the future, hoping that there will be a compliance market. Then some voluntary carbon offsetting, and finally for CSR purposes and also branding. As I said, there is a strong emergence of secondary forest carbon markets, more and more. And we can see as well that there are growing involvement of the financial institution in REDD+, which also can be seen as also growing confidence in the future of REDD+. So now I'd like to tell you a bit more about what are the challenges for the private sector involvement. First, the first challenge is that there is a lot of uncertainty on the long-term and robust demand for REDD+ credits. And then this is a reason as well that the private sector is also looking at what is happening at the international level and at the national level. And given that REDD+ is actually a policy-driven market, one position of IETA and suggestion was that the UNFCCC should also play a central role to ensure that there is demand for those tradable REDD+ credits by increasing actually the mitigation target, having some more ambitious mitigation targets, and recognizing REDD+ as one way of achieving those mitigation targets, so that we can also ensure some more robust demand on the long term for those credits. Also, something which is very important, very critical so far, is the lack of clear regulatory and policy framework. And therefore, there is need for a strong policy signal and policy clarity both at the international and national level. A lot of countries have involved in REDD+ readiness strategies and are part of the FCPF and UN REDD processes, but there is no need for clear national REDD+ strategies, national emission targets, and clear defined roles and responsibilities. And to make clear as well at the national level how the government wants to involve the private sector. Some other challenges that are preventing the private sector to involve somehow is the unclear land tenure and carbon ownership systems. There is need to have some tangible commodities and to have some clear mechanism to know who owns the land and who owns the carbon, which can be two different things in the REDD+ mechanism, of course. And but whoever owns the carbon rights, and most of the time the private sector, of course, wants to own the carbon rights, but there is need to actually have clear consultation with the communities so that they actually understand what will be the impact for them of having the private sector investing on the land, and to have clear benefit sharing mechanism on who is going to also benefit from the flow of the carbon benefits. There is also need for more legal basis for the private investment. So far, this is a concern as well from the government perspective, that there is not yet due diligence in the investment process. And there should be such a process where you can actually have information at the national level on who is investing in what, who are the private sector who is investing in, and so that all the stakeholders which are involved, whether private sector, government, third sector, or communities, can actually have the same type of information, and there is like a level playing field. For instance, there was development of National Red Plus Registry, more and more. In the RC, we have this National Red Plus Registry, which tracks all the investment from the private sector, and also along with the social and environmental impact. And such tool could also be quite interesting to expand in more countries. Another concern is the insurance and risk sharing mechanism, both for the project level and for the political risk. But the concern is to see exactly how to set up those mechanisms so it is actually agreeable both for the private sector and the government level. And finally as well to set up some appropriate arbitration procedures in case the private sector, for instance, or any other stakeholder, the government or the communities, do not deliver on the contract that they have engaged, or in case there is an issue in the sharing the benefit from the carbon, there is need for proper arbitration, and that would be actually also much more easy if there would be such arbitration procedure at the national level rather than at the international level, and also where the country, in the country where the project is implemented. Currently, for instance, for the CDM mechanism, the arbitration procedure are in the country where the buyer is there, whereas actually it would be more interesting for the REDD Plus mechanism that the arbitration is actually in the country where you are implementing your project, not where the buyer will buy the project. And some appropriate social and environmental safeguards. There are a lot of concern as well with the private sector being involved on the different, on the practices actually to get what we call FPIC, the free, prior and informed consent of the communities, and the right to actually withhold consent. So this is also an area of concern. At the same time, the private sector, at least a lot of actors from the private sector are actually keen, very much keen on implementing strong and binding social and environmental safeguards because their credibility is also at stake. And so I think it's really having more consultation between the private sector, the government and the communities. And in that regard, IASD, as Jessica was saying, has been working more on the safeguard aspect. So they have also tackled a bit more in their report that aspect. So coming to the potential strategies to stimulate private sector involvement in REDD+, the first strategy would be to enhance investment through compliance carbon markets. So far, there is the voluntary carbon market, but it's not enough. It is not big enough to actually enable to achieve the critical mass of emission reduction we need for REDD+. And so more and more actually stakeholders advocate, for REDD+ to be involved in compliance markets. And from last year in COP17, in the decision, we could read that there was actually possibilities to have some appropriate market-based mechanism for REDD+ to be developed, which seemed to be like a signal for the possibility to have such compliance market for REDD+ in the future. And there are some new and emerging compliance markets, several ones that I have mentioned here in California, South Korea, Australia and Japan. In particular, the California cap and trade system is going to be probably the first market for compliance market for REDD+. So that could be quite an interesting area to look at and some interesting prospect for the REDD+ market. The second important strategy is to use a nested framework, crediting using a nested framework. Why? First, as REDD+, you know that so far REDD+ is a national objective, of course. Nevertheless, in many countries, we have already some pilot projects with the private sector taking the lead at the subnational level, even if there is not yet some clear national strategy. So in the future, once they have to actually fit in the national system, how is it going to work? If we want the private sector to still be involved, there is need to use a nested framework that could allow direct insurance of performance-based payment to the private sector at the subnational level. In that way, this would actually enable them to still be able to directly invest and not to have to rely on the government to actually get the payment based on the project. And that would also enable to credit the subnational project independently from the overall national performance. If your project is performing well, but for some reason at the national level overall you have underperformed, you can still get actually your credit at the subnational level. And the fact that we have a nested approach and that it would be integrated jurisdiction-wide accounting framework within a country, that would also enable to reduce the risk of intra-leakage country, that also gives some more comfort for the buyers. The last strategy is to engage the private sector in national level strategies. As I mentioned before, it's important to actually involve all kinds of stakeholders from the private sector, both the ones that are already involved in the REDD+ business, but also involving the actors that are driving deforestation, and see with them what are the possibilities, how can they actually engage in REDD+, or at least mitigate the negative impact so far. And it's very important as well as a role for the private sector to be involved so that they can participate to shape the overall policy framework that is win-win for all parties, all the private sector, the government, and all the affected stakeholders. So with that, I think I am done, and I gave you a quick overview of what are the main key players, the trends in terms of the motivation and how they actually involve in the supply chain, the challenges and the most promising strategies. You can find, if you're interested in more information, on our website, or just outside we have a table with some copies of the report.
Congratulations to Florence and to her team for this research. It certainly is an interesting approach. It's the first time we've seen this concept of supply chain applied to REDD+, and it helps us understand the various roles of the private sector and the range of potential investments and motivations. I would like later on to ask Florence actually to be clearer about what are the policy signals that's necessary from the negotiations point of view. One is very clear about compliance markets. I mean, a stronger mitigation, legally binding mitigation commitments by all countries. That's not, as you know, if you've been following both the LCA and now the ADP negotiations, that's not going to happen for a while. So what does that mean? I mean, if in fact you won't have those targets agreed on by the parties, I'm not even sure whether by 2015 to be implemented by 2020 in the ADP negotiations, whether that will happen or not. Certainly the issues around the safeguards having appropriate safeguards, unclear land tenure and carbon ownership, legal basis for private investments. Those are being discussed, I mean, as part of the whole system of safeguards and governance around REDD+. So I think it's possible to try to influence that in the direction with which the private sector would be comfortable with how it will resolve. Certainly, the Philippines and the groups that I've worked with have pushed very hard for the safeguards, and we've found a common ally in the private sector in moving the safeguards forward. The state right now, it's in a way, and here's the the disconnect between what's needed for the private sector investment, private sector involvement in REDD+, the disconnect between what's needed to get that going, to enhance that, and the negotiations itself. In a way, the negotiations in REDD+, whether it's in the substa or in the LCA, has turned inward to itself. And trying essentially to find a procedural way to move forward, since many of the processes are ending the LCA process particularly is ending this year. So the negotiations will largely focus on how you're going to move, instead of the substance of REDD+ and giving additional signals to like openness to markets and things like that. The focus of the discussions next week, I anticipate, would actually be how to move this discussion to another body within the UNFCCC, whether it will be a new committee or whether it just be given to the subsidiary body in implementation. So my point being that we are probably have to be satisfied with whatever signal we are getting now from the international process with what we have now and make do with it. I mean, my own view is that there's enough already in the international policy framework with which countries can go move forward to implement. And you should not expect more at this stage. And that we've actually pushed the envelope on this for as far as it could go. And we have to wait a couple of years. And probably, in fact, I suspect more than any new process within the SBI, for example, it's really how the ADP process will incorporate REDD+, LULUCF, agriculture, sort of the whole land use area into a framework that can move this forward beyond what we have now. I mean, and so I personally actually have, well, I'm still following REDD+ in the LCA and have colleagues, I have more colleagues doing that now, and I've begun to migrate to the ADP as sort of the future framework under which REDD+, agriculture, LULUCF sort of merge together in some kind of approach to land use to climate and land use, which in the end might send bigger and stronger signals to all of us.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Tony. So Jonathan and Armand, do you just want to comment on the back of Tony's thoughts around, we've got as much as we can at this stage from policies. Is that enough for you guys to move forward from private sector perspectives?
Good. So I'm Jonathan Shopley. So if you just, I'll get directly to your question very quickly. Maybe I should do that straight up and say I'm worried from what I've heard. Because the carbon neutral company has operated for about 15 years in the voluntary carbon market, and everybody is looking at the voluntary carbon market as the sort of interrelated between now and Tony, your comment about a very difficult landscape to 2020, probably 2022. The voluntary carbon market is 130 million tons, of which REDD is about 10%. So it's really quite small. The investment cycles in good REDD projects that deliver investment-grade credits that corporates want to buy, as they are the private market. Very long investment cycles, very hard to tell the story, very risky. Most of the investment people that I speak to do not call this an investment-grade asset yet. So there are a fair number of challenges. But I'd like to sort of go back to Florence landscape and just say, I think I'd like to. I think it's a great piece of work. It sort of shows who's playing what role. There's an enormous amount of capacity, money, experience, great projects that are evolving right around the world. But it still represents enormous risk. And the part, Florence, that I would want to do about your work is to sort of put it in the context of the wider carbon markets. We love REDD. We understand it. People are passionate about it. And if I could talk about this with 400 corporate clients that we work with, many of them sort of respond passionately to the issue. And then once, and I would say that of the corporate population who could generate a gigaton of demand, but currently, remember, are doing less than 150 million tons total on voluntary action. Respond passionately, and then there's sort of this values action gap that we see in any environmental market. 80% of people in developed economies generally want to do the right thing. When they start to spend money, that demand sort of slips back down to about 3 to 5% of the population who actually make decisions that make a difference. And so what they're looking for in the wider carbon market is a sort of a comparison between their sort of passionate connection and understanding of the importance of REDD and the prices of carbon, CDM prices, the prices for renewables, etc. We're setting some rather frightening benchmarks at the moment. We understand the risks involved in REDD mean higher, deeper investments in those kinds of projects. But when it comes to a corporate deciding on a voluntary basis to offset its emissions, we are competing, really is competing in a market that is awash. Very long, credits that are very cheap. And so corporates are looking, therefore, I think, Florence, you're right about CSR brand, but I think you sort of want to dig a little deeper into that. There's a certain amount of future-proofing. We need stronger government signals that this is going to be an instrument. There's a lot that the corporate sector hates about the public sector involved in climate change, but many of the rump of corporates sort of look to government as the proxy for quality and reassurance. And without any kind of indications of that, it's difficult. So the other sort of missing piece of your landscape, from my perspective, is the public areas. Countries like Norway and others who are saying, we're going to be a buyer, we're going to generate demand. But ultimately, unless, the part of the private sector that we work with are those who are putting money on the table to buy and retire credits, the final buyer. And investors in project upstream won't do that because they can see it. And I think it would be useful for those countries that are leading programs for market readiness, and putting money and development aid into this area, pay more attention about giving some strong buying signals to help unlock what I think is strong potential, latent potential in the private sector.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Armin, Jonathan's just outlined how much risk there is in interacting in REDD and investing in REDD. Please, can you give your perspectives on why Allianz has decided to step into this arena?
Yeah, thank you, Sophie Boulou. So maybe to avoid a misunderstanding that's from time to time is coming up, because I'm not working for an alliance of climate solutions, I'm looking for Allianz as the financial giant. So that brings me to the first issue. To get the right feeling here, who's in the room working as an investor or portfolio manager? No one. So, okay, that's good, because it brings me to the most interesting thing, that we are working in a very complex environment. So, of course, we are one of the investors in the REDD environment. So we made a lot of experience in the last couple of years. Background of Allianz is that we decided to be market neutralized with our carbon footprint. That was the basic idea. And I was worked in my former life as investment banker and gave the seed money for First Climate, I think one of your competitors. And so the management board is also former Allianz colleagues. So I was very sure that if we would like to do that as Allianz, I can do it better than to buy very boring carbon credits from the market. So as I'm in the carbon investment team, we decided to create a virtual portfolio, so a blind pool, and in that case, also REDD comes in our mind. So after a few experiences, we made some set ones in Indonesia. We decided to take a stake of a project developer, which runs very successful. I have to be a little bit careful what I'm saying now, because we brought a stake of White Works, and Mike Kaczynski is sitting in the last row. So it's a good cooperation, and so a good traveling. So, but nevertheless, the most important thing for us to do that way was that we try to create a mixed portfolio. Our world is very simple. We are dealing with pension funds, money. So we are dealing with premium reserve stocks, very specific asset under the controlling of supervisory authorities around Europe. Makes it extremely complicated to do our investment processes. That is one of the reasons why REDD is an interesting opportunity for us. But I would say I can talk for a lot of life insurance companies and pension fund companies, and we are the mainstream of the cash flow world. So it is not a trivial one. So you have to explain in a very detailed way to your investment committees how you can to structure a deal in the REDD field. And that more or less had nothing to do with methodology or with other things, very detailed, which are important for the negotiation process here. The most important thing for us is what about the price curves in the carbon market? It's very easy. So because if you're looking in a portfolio, in a typical portfolio of a carbon investor, then let's say your REDD is 10%, you mentioned that, also for the market. We would say that's also the case in our portfolio. We have energy efficiency projects and we have renewable energy projects. And the good thing with renewable energy is you have a cash flow that depends on power purchase agreements or feed-in tariff systems. That means you have a stable cash flow. And that is, if it works well, it's a very safe cash flow or cash yield. In the case of REDD certificates, it depends on price signals to 100%. That makes it extremely volatile, and that is one of the reasons why it's complicated to do the argumentation with your investment committees to take a bigger stake of REDD certificates. I would say that is the case for all of us, and that is one of the biggest barriers in looking at this.
Thanks very much.